Good morning, everyone. I'm Philip Osteen, Dean of the University of Utah College of Social Work. My pleasure to welcome you today to our Grand Challenges for Social Work presentation. As many of you may know, the Grand Challenges for Social Work are a national call to action for our field's practitioners and researchers with a goal to harness social work science and knowledge base, to collaborate with individuals, community-based organizations, and professionals from all fields and disciplines, and to work together to tackle prevalent social harms. First, on behalf of the College of Social Work, I'm especially proud to recognize the contributions of our American Indian community members by acknowledging that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. As you may be aware, January is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And within that context, we're especially honored to welcome Dr. Minh Dang, who will discuss her research and practice with survivors of human trafficking. Dr. Dang is the co-founder and executive director of Survival Alliance, an international non-governmental organization that empowers survivors of slavery and human trafficking to be leaders in their own communities. She's also a research fellow and lead in survivor scholarship and well-being at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. She earned her PhD in politics and contemporary history from the University of Nottingham, where her doctoral work focused on the well-being of survivors of slavery and human trafficking. Dr. Dang was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a proud two-time UC Berkeley alum, earning her bachelor's degree in sociology and her master's degree in social welfare. Her emphasis has been on community mental health. She's a fan of farmers markets, loves to sing, and is the person making silly faces at your kids in the supermarket. You will rarely find her without a journal or post-it notes, and she hopes that someone will pay her to launch a stationery line called Minspiration. Following her presentation, Dr. Dang will have about 30 minutes to take questions. And please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit any questions you might have. We also invite you to be attentive to yourself and your own well-being during this event. This topic can be challenging for everyone, but especially for survivors of human trafficking or interpersonal violence. If you reach a point during this presentation when you feel you need to take a break, please do so, and you can always come back to the recording later. If anyone does need to leave the webinar, I invite remaining attendees to join me in a commitment to refrain from making assumptions about individuals' lived experiences or comfort level with direct outreach from others. We trust that everyone here can reach out for the support they need. But if not, please feel free to reach out to the College of Social Work, and we encourage you to utilize the Save UT app for support. And with that, please welcome Dr. Dang to the virtual stage.
Dr. Dang, it looks like you're muted.
Thank you for letting me know. Hi, thank you so much for having me. And it's just like today to have me mute at the start. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm imagining seeing you somewhere out there. I want to start with everyone reflecting for a moment on the word legacy. What does that mean to you? What comes up for you? Just pause. Today, I'm going to talk about a couple of things: legacy, well-being, and our role as a collective in both. So, as was mentioned, my name is Minh Dang. I am currently based in the UK in England, but have only been here for 5 years, so most of my time was spent in California. I want to thank you Dean Austin for the introduction. I find that I am quite moved anytime there is a land recognition. I know that that can be done tokenistically, and yet I will say for me, it is humbling and a reminder of traumatic history. And I think one of the challenging things that we have today is, maybe this is true all the time, but there's the phrase, you never know what someone's going through. And when we recognize the land acknowledgements, or we have the land acknowledgement, I think it's another recognition that most of us live with a pain and sorrow along with whatever it is that's joyful in our lives, whether immediately or in our intergenerational history. So in terms of anyone going through immediate challenge, I want to just kind of acknowledge that it's hard and you're here, and thank you. I think particularly I want to make note to the API community out in California due to recent violence that's been happening out there. And also a very happy Lunar New Year to those of you who are celebrating. So I am going to share my screen, and before anyone asks, yes, you can have access to these slides later. Okay. So the title of my talk today is Living Our Legacy. And I want to give due credit to one of our staff at Survivor Alliance who came up with this title. This is Survivor Alliance's 5th anniversary as an organization, and you'll hear a little bit more about us later. But one of the key things that we talk about is legacy, and Survivor Alliance is what I would consider part of my legacy. And so in celebrating, we wanted to share what our legacy has been, even in the short 5 years, but what we hope it to be. But instead of talking about leaving a legacy, we thought that this active form of living, being alive in the process of creating and building a legacy, was really important to harness, and really speaks to what I found in my doctoral research. So I want to give a content notice. I decided to change this from content warning, I think, because those of us who live with trauma, we can live with extreme levels of alertness or hypervigilance, as mental health people want to say. But I think I want to share it more as a standard. We live in the world where we don't know what is going to happen necessarily, and we don't know what might bring up grief or joy or trauma or reactions. So in terms of the content here, there will be some anecdotes of people's lived experiences of human trafficking, of suicidality, but not any gory details, just mentioning the fact that people have had those experiences. And so, as was mentioned, please do take care of yourself as you need to. So starting with definition, this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, that legacy is defined in 2 ways: the long-term impact of something that has occurred, and something that is passed down or left behind by a person who has come before us. So when you think about the long-term impact of something, I think I write and talk about it as the legacy of trauma, especially interpersonal trauma and interpersonal violence. There is a long-term impact, and you will hear about it in terms of the psychological impact, hopefully the financial, social, emotional, familial impact. But as a social worker myself, I think one of the things that I see focused a lot on is the negative consequences and the negative long-term impact of trauma. Yes, now there's more and more research on post-traumatic growth and where people grow post experiences of trauma. And yet, majority of language and research is about how negative the impact is. And I'm not interested in creating a rosy picture of trauma, but it does raise the question of, if that's the conversation around trauma, what do people who've survived trauma feel? When I share with people that my work is with survivors of human trafficking, typically the response is, oh, or that must be hard. And yes, trauma is hard. And yet it has an impact if we relate to people who have trauma with this fear, or it's all going to be really difficult. And then the other side of this concept of legacy is something that's passed down or left behind by a person who's come before us. So sometimes we think about legacy in the construct of, or in the context of people passing. What's the legacy that they have left? But what I really appreciate is that we can actually think about what we want to pass down or leave behind now, that we are constantly creating what our legacy is. And I interviewed for this job, surprisingly, in the tech industry. And one of the questions was, what would you like your great, 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 great grandchildren to say about you when you're not around to even hear about it? What are the stories that you hope your family or people who know you pass down? And so that required us to think about it now. And as survivors of interpersonal trauma, it is something that I see and witnessed in my research that comes up for people. Want to make sure we're on the same page of what I mean as survivor. So although my work is around survivors of human trafficking, I know that this term is not monopolized by us. So here I'm focusing mostly on survivors who've lived experience of interpersonal violence and who've exited the situation. So when I talk about survivors of human trafficking, it's someone who was a victim, but is now living outside of exploitation. And I highlight this because oftentimes the word victim and survivor is conflated, particularly in the anti-trafficking sector. Talking about victims, there's nothing wrong with being a victim. It is typically a legal, based on a legal framework of someone who had a harm done to them rather than the perpetrator of a crime. It's often really important for someone to realize that they were a victim and not a criminal. But in the anti-trafficking space, we talk a lot about identifying victims, people who are currently being exploited. And my work is with survivors, people who have lived through it and who are now outside of it. So this is really important because of nowadays the imagery that is out there about victims and people who've been through human trafficking are quite sensationalized, I would say. They are people who are in chains, people represented as barcodes, with their mouths covered. And that is a difficult image to be associated with, especially for someone like me who identifies as a survivor and is the CEO of an organization, has run programs and projects, and has my PhD. This is not to say that I don't lie on the floor sobbing and crying at times, but to be associated only with this image of a helpless, brutalized person is not useful in terms of what people think of when they think of survivors of human trafficking, and I imagine survivors of other violence. So I'll move on a bit to the focus of my talk here, which is on well-being. So, living into our legacy, a pathway to survivors' well-being. So what exactly is well-being? I wanted to put it up here and frame it in a colloquial way, in the sense that we talk often about health and well-being, kind of assuming that they're different things, but really connected. But on the opposite side, they are usually compared to illness and ill-being. So this idea that well-being is the absence of ill-being or illness. that health is the absence of illness. And although we've moved beyond this, the medical model of health and well-being still is the predominant model in our systems, that you are not well if you have an illness or you have a diagnosis of some sort. So what this does is actually relegates health and well-being to people who don't have mental health diagnoses or don't have long-term consequences of trauma. It is not true that all survivors of trauma have a mental illness diagnosis, and yet many people do have challenges with their physical, mental, psychological health. And well-being seems to be, if we focus it from the medical model of health, something that we don't think that is available to survivors. So the World Health Organization actually has moved beyond this concept of health as the absence of ill-being. So here's two definitions. So the World Health Organization has defined well-being as, so well-being encompasses quality of life and the ability of people and societies to contribute to the world with a sense of meaning and purpose. So we heard even before, they mentioned take care of your own well-being. So you're taking care of your quality of life, and you're taking care of your ability to contribute to the world with a sense of meaning and purpose. So if we think about it that way, what is it? So if I am really upset by a talk and I need to step out to take care of my well-being, I'm taking care of my immediate quality of life. I'm taking care of my sense of meaning and purpose. Now, that's not really a common way of thinking about it, right? We typically think of taking care of our well-being as really taking care of our health. And here, the World Health Organization defines health as the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So here, health includes the presence of well-being. So essentially, the World Health Organization is saying you cannot be well if you don't have physical well-being. So a physical quality of life, mental well-being, a mental quality of life, or social well-being. So focusing on quality of life and our ability to contribute with meaning and purpose really has nothing to do with diagnoses. And so this aspect, I believe, is something that we don't focus enough on, that we focus more on the absence of disease and infirmity. Share two other definitions of well-being out there. So Martin Seligman, who many of you may know from writing Flourish, it's a book out there that was really kind of promoting the idea of positive psychology and well-being. And his definition is that well-being is what free people will choose for their own sake. And it has 5 elements: positive emotion, engagement, meaning, positive relationships, and accomplishment. And so for him, well-being is a construct. It's not a thing in of itself, but it is comprised of these 5 elements. And where you land on measures of these 5 elements contributes to this idea of well-being. I think what's really interesting here is that he calls out this idea of what free people choose, and that begs the question of what defines a free person. And when we're talking about survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery, that is a real, I think, point of contention. Ed Diner, as well as colleagues Lucas and Oishi, focus a lot on subjective well-being. And this is more your own assessment of your evaluation, your own evaluation or assessment of your quality of life. So it's not necessarily, I think the idea is if there's a kind of positivist, sort of real life version of well-being, let's say your liver might not be functioning, but your assessment of your quality of life is fantastic. So the idea is that subjective well-being is important, and there's a lot of research and done on this. So there isn't, as you probably know, and many academics and practitioners know, there's no one definition for these things. But what I want to highlight here is that health, illness, and well-being still tend to focus on the individual. And I say tend to because these definitions are from the Western, American, European research world. And there are other collectivist cultures that actually have well-being defined in other ways and different practices. But here in the Western world, we still focus a lot of health, illness, and well-being focused on the individual. So it'd be really interesting to not have, someone is diagnosed individually with depression, but society is diagnosed with the inability to provide adequate external motivation for this person, right? It's where are we locating the issue or the problem? Similarly, we think of homelessness as the issue of an individual person. Somebody is without a home, rather than what if homelessness is the societal failure to provide adequate housing to its people and citizens. So where we locate the problem or the issue really affects our delivery of solutions and how we consider how we address the problem. Oops. So I am very influenced by attachment theorists. And so here's a quote from Don Winnicott: "There's no such thing as an infant," meaning, of course, that wherever one finds an infant, one finds maternal care. And without maternal care, there would be no infant. So I share this quote because I often reference it when I think of there's no such thing as an individual. When we think of health, well-being, and illness from an individual perspective, we're forgetting one of the key things that social workers think about is the environment and the context. There's no such thing as an individual health or well-being without the environment and the context that it exists in. Just like there's no such thing as an infant without the mother. The infant literally comes from another human being. And this is not to say, as somebody who has had very poor maternal care, that an infant does not exist literally in terms of if they don't have that maternal care, the baby still is in existence. But the absence of psychologically existing to a mother and how that can actually affect its physical existence, if you look at the strange situation and other attachment studies, it can genuinely affect their actual physical existence. And so we need to be considering how we exist in relationship. Always, we come into the world in relationship, and I posit that well-being exists relationally because of the fact that as individuals, we are always informed by the social. So the other reason why I wanted to focus on well-being is because it is rarely studied. And as I mentioned, the positive psychology field came about thinking, well, how come we're studying illness all the time? Psychology really focused a lot on illness and diagnosis. We've got the DSM, but how are we going to understand what makes people well unless we study well people and people who have good health and psychological well-being? And so while I support that idea, I think more and more studies have looked at what is well-being for people who also still have psychological illness or diagnoses. And if we think of it from the disability rights movement and mental health service user movement, this idea that people can exist and be healthy and well, even with illness as it's defined by the medical system or psychological mental illness. So what I saw as a scholar, practitioner, and survivor is that the focus was all on what is wrong. How do we support people with PTSD? How do we diagnose people? How do we provide mental health support? I'm not saying that's not important, but what it failed to consider was everything beyond that. And so, without boring you with my literature review, it is very rarely studied, and well-being is often conflated with the absence of illness. And so what's really studied when you look at survivors of human trafficking is the presence of deleterious outcomes. There are studies on suicide, on depression, on occupational health related stuff, physical health, where AIDS, STD, long-term disability, pains, physical pains. So that is what's out there about survivors. So well-being is not studied, whether it's subjective well-being or well-being from the World Health Organization standpoint. Well-being in general, very understudied. And then to add on top of that, it's not studied from survivors' perspectives. And I think, you'll see in a bit, I am very led by Indigenous methodologies and having things be survivor-led. And so what would we think of when we think about well-being if it is studied from the perspective of survivors? So here's where I kind of found my niche and kind of thought, well, if it's not being studied, why not introduce the study of well-being from the perspective of survivors from the start, rather than have this canon of literature based on non-survivors' perspective of well-being, kind of bringing the medical model in, starting it from the lived experiences. So this is where you get my doctoral dissertation. What's really important to say is that I launched Survivor Alliance, the nonprofit, simultaneous to doing a PhD. I don't recommend that to everybody. I did somehow meet my current husband in it, so maybe that was my way of having a life outside, but don't do 2 full-time jobs, basically. But I explicitly pursued a PhD to provide access and power to my community and to be able to drive survivor-informed solutions and to bring some academic backing to it. And to challenge myself to see if my vision and perspective of survivor-led work was worth it and new. So well-being, in our own words, survivors of slavery defining well-being, I want to recognize I'm in a US context here, and the transatlantic slave trade and the history of racism that continues based on that is not to be undermined and questioned. Slavery and modern slavery is the term that's used in the UK. And while there can, another time can debate about definitions, it's in that context that I did my PhD. I also use slavery because of my own perspective on the fact that slavery definitions are not informed by survivors. So for the research geeks out there, and to give you a sense of the background of my study, it was qualitative and the data was collected 2019 to 2020. So I think I did my last interview 2 weeks before lockdown occurred in the UK. Thank goodness. It was a constructivist grounded theory approach, and as I mentioned, influenced by Indigenous methodology. So I did semi-structured interview with 16 self-identified survivors of modern slavery, as I mentioned, based under that definition and living in the UK. So I did self-disclose that I identify as a survivor to folks, but from the US, and that was it. But that was part of the methodology of researching within my own community, being an insider rather than an outsider. And of course, recognizing that I didn't have the same lived experiences as the people who were living in the UK. And I hand coded line by line and did constant comparison, if you know grounded theory. So induction and abduction, and came up with definition that I will be presenting to you. Happy to answer any questions about methodology. So the first part of my definition that I came to develop from these over 11 hours of recordings and analyzing is that well-being for survivors of slavery is a relational process that enables and sustains practices for answering existential questions about meaning and purpose. So you can see some similarities to the World Health Organization definition in terms of meaning and purpose coming into it. But what's different, the two elements that I see are different to existing definitions of well-being is that it's a process rather than a state, a state of mind or state of being. And it is relational. So it's not something that exists in the individual, but it exists between people. And yes, you can still, I propose that you can still look to measuring it from the perspective of one individual, but that it needs to be, if you're measuring or evaluating a process, you're evaluating all the things that go into the process, not just one factor, one contribution, which is the individual and their biology and all of that. So that well-being is a process, not a destination, and that it is through our relationships that it exists. But what is that process for? I suggest that it's for enabling and sustaining practices, that well-being is a process that exists in the doing. And that doing is to contribute to these existential questions about meaning and purpose. So it's not necessarily that survivors need to have a meaning that is set, but that being a survivor of human trafficking or slavery is, it goes to the heart of existential questions. And so just being in the process of exploring and coming to an answer about them, those questions, is key. Just staying in it. And I will share a little bit more, but the real key to that is because every single person I interviewed, and it matches to my practice experience, is that every single person that I interviewed talked significantly about suicide, whether active experiences of it or previous experiences of it, when asking them about what their well-being means to them and what is well-being. And that people were still engaging in questions about meaning and purpose. Just to share that the people that I interviewed were survivors, so exited slavery and trafficking. The minimum the minimum sort of period of time that someone was out was 11 months, and another person had been out for, I think, over 15 years. So it's not just suicide in the experiences of trafficking, but in the life after. And so we need to be thinking about people's lives and how people are dealing with the aftermath and the long-term consequences of trauma. I want to highlight here that I really honed in on two aspects, meaning and purpose being different. So although it can get really muddled and to seem really overlapping, but what I saw is that people need to have an explanation. Why be alive? Why am I alive? Whether somebody came to that answer through their faith or someone came to it from a evolutionary perspective or some other reason. You'll hear man's search for meaning and kind of the fact that humans are meaning-making beings. And so needing to have a reason. Why am I the one that went through it? And separate from that, though, a purpose. What do I live for? Okay, and they can be connected, that I'm alive in order to raise my child. But I am alive because God put me on this planet to raise my child. I am alive because I did X, Y, and Z to save myself. But now I'm here to live for ensuring nobody else goes through it. And that the practices that enable people to keep answering these questions is really key, because it's that when at the heart of being exploited for human trafficking and modern slavery is that you are existing for somebody else's purpose, or you are existing merely to survive the current situation you are in. So just getting to have ownership over answering these questions is really important to people. So well-being, the practices that people engage in to sustain the questions and to engage in their own answer to the questions of meaning and purpose are related to managing the impact of trauma, building a life worth living, and learning about freedom from slavery and human trafficking. So managing the impact of trauma, the practices you can imagine are pretty standard around coping with trauma, whether it's medication, being busy, exercise. So people in actively engaging those things are able to connect to the fact of, I am alive because I have this body and I literally got out of it. Or my purpose is because I have this body, I can continue existing. And that this is ongoing. So well-being, as we talked about, isn't the absence of illness. It is being in the active managing of whether it is like mental illness diagnoses or other diagnosed illnesses or other impacts of trauma that are not related to the medical or mental health field at all. Impacts of trauma include the loss of time, related to, I see people who are my age who've done X, Y, or Z. If I had not been exploited, I would have gotten to do X, Y, or Z. Practices related to building a life worth living. So education, parenting, a job, volunteering. People need to feel like they are building towards their own life. As I mentioned, in exploitation, it's not your own purpose, it's not your own life that you're living. And so having opportunities to build a life worth living is really important, but also to be engaged in the process of it. And then lastly, some of the practices that contribute to people's process of well-being is to learn about freedom from slavery. And so if you can imagine, imagining it, if, in order for empathy, being in the situation of exploitation, and I know I'm assuming here, most of you know what that means, what human trafficking looks like. But if I say someone who is in bonded labor in India, who is forced to work all day carrying bricks, and then they exit, and their whole being has been about surviving each day, relearning what does it mean to get up and not be driven by survival, learning that they don't serve somebody else, that they get to choose what they eat, that there's so many things that we learn when we live in what I say continuous freedom that we don't even realize. And it's sometimes when someone actually has that experience that they realize they never had it before. right? So realizing I never thought, for myself, for example, I just assumed I would be in therapy forever. And I'm realizing, oh, that's not, that doesn't have to be true. I can choose that if I would like. So there's this element of well-being that is unique, I think, to survivors of human trafficking and slavery that is not unique to others who haven't been through the experience, that I wanted to highlight because so many people talked about that in their interviews of well-being is when I know that there's someone I can call. And when I looked at other existing definitions and studies of well-being and the measurement tools, like the quality of life measurement tools or subjective well-being, there aren't the questions that I heard survivors talking about. Like, I know someone I can talk to, or I have somebody I can invite to my birthday party. So these elements of life that people often take for granted. I'm going to try and, oh, yes, sorry, I am in a office space. Okay, I am looking at the time, and I think what I want to do is just, I will try and get through my next 4 slides, but in terms of transitioning, kind of where this research took me to is really thinking about, the title of living our legacy in terms of the work that Survivor Alliance does. We give people the opportunity to do all of these things: manage the impact of trauma, build a life worth living, and learn about freedom from slavery. And that's not how we designed it. But when I thought about Survivor Alliance and how we focus on survivor leadership. So survivor leadership is about using one's lived experience in order to benefit somebody else. You can be a survivor of something and not decide to share your lived experience or even advise anybody based on it. I want to be clear, survivor leadership for us is not necessarily telling a trauma story, and in fact, more not that, but using your lived experience to inform policy, programming, and practices and research. So it might be because I'm a survivor of trafficking at the hands of my parents. Maybe I want to inform parenting classes, or I want to inform stuff policy around child abuse, right? But I don't have to necessarily talk about the details of my trauma. And so in our work to help people think about their areas of expertise, they get to find a purpose. They get to potentially manage the impact of trauma through having, whether it's being busy or having a place to go, meetings to go to. It gives them motivation. It helps them build skills in terms of, because we do everything from professional skills training, how to use Zoom, how to type, how to make a resume, all those things. People are learning new skills. They're learning about freedom from slavery because they're learning about their rights. They're learning about the anti-trafficking sector. They're learning about what jobs are out there. So for us, we are really trying to create ways that people can have meaning and purpose that is focused on the impact that they want to have. And that is to deal with the fact that you can't change your past. And the legacy of trauma is not something that people have a choice over, but what they can do in terms of leaving something behind is something they have some influence over. And so because there's some alignment between what we do and what contributes to well-being, it's why we've at Survivor Alliance have talked about sort of this legacy building model of practice. And so central to that is that lived experience is a source of expertise. And so I want to really have people think of not that lived experience and survivor expertise is better or worse than learned experience. We need allies, we need to have people with the learned knowledge, but there are things that come from lived experience that are not going to be accessible to people who haven't been through it. I think many of us know this when we sort of feel like, oh, you don't get it if you're not from Utah, or you've never lived here, or you don't get it if you're not from South America, or if you're not a woman, or, we have that experience so much. And so if that's what we can experience, the you don't get it, well, how do we work with people who do get it and help us get it? And I think we don't spend enough time really helping people with lived experience articulate things, because we have our own language and theories and ideas of what it will look like, or we try and take people's narratives and fit it in our existing models rather than have survivors really articulate it for themselves or ourselves. That healing from trauma is an individual and collective practice. And so when I interviewed survivors, those practices that people were engaging in were in relationship to themselves, but also to each other. So people talked about in relationship to care providers, to other survivors, to practitioners. And people also really talked about their relationship with themselves and how that was influenced by other people. Just like babies learn about their own goodness or their own capacities through relationships, us as adults, we learn through our relationships with people, the feedback we get. And, we see this with the survivors we work with in Survivor Alliance. People look to us and say, can I really do that? It's like, yeah, if you want to, you can. And a lot of kind of just affirmation and support. We talk in mental health, there's the unconditional positive regard. In some ways, that survivors really do need that space to learn and fail and be okay with it. Because for a long time, there was no space to learn and fail. It was all do or die. And I think I am going to stop sharing because I realized my next slide here is not, it's basically a repeat. So let me find my remaining slides. Sorry about that. I'm going to have to share with you from a different presentation. The third principle for us is community building resists oppressive practices and challenges structural inequality. So in our work, community is part of the well-being process. So it's not that you go deal with your trauma over there, but we have spaces for people to share how they manage their trauma when they're doing anti-trafficking work, or how they deal with it when they're at work. And so in and of itself, building community resists this idea that we have to go over there and fix ourselves and heal our trauma. But also, when you bring collectives together, people can organize. People can see, oh, wait a second, we all don't have access to trauma-informed therapy. Oh, well, let's do something about that together. And so again, it's not just about individuals need to fix their situations, but actually we can fix the structures and the systems that have put us in this place. And then lastly, that our work is about activities shifting society and creating shifts that will actually improve our lived realities. So for Survivor Alliance, when we talk about working with survivors of human trafficking, it's not this idea that we just want for us to deal better with our trauma, but that there's actual quality of life changes. And so that means that we don't just think that we have better lives, but it's kind of this idea that when you get out of abusive situations, anything slightly better might seem great, but actually that people have access to real jobs, real income, real security, So but what we see right now is that so many people, for those of you who are in the sector, Polaris just released a study that a majority of survivors, and they had the N of their survey was over 400, make less than $25,000 a year. And so when we're thinking about actually pushing for real world change, it's not just, and we're talking about individual practice of social workers, we don't just need help managing our trauma, but we need to build sustainable, equitable systems. And so just to kind of tie it all together, while we then open for questions, is to say, for what I've learned through research and practice is that for survivors of human trafficking, and I would propose other interpersonal violence, that this long-term legacy of trauma lives with us, and we need to have spaces to build another legacy, our own legacy. And in building that legacy, that enables us a purpose, and purpose being so central to well-being, that it is this community-based work, this activism, this lived experience expertise that can be an avenue to well-being, because it can be an avenue to what gives us hope, what enables us to make, I don't just say make lemonade out of lemons. I talk about making gold out of poison, doing this alchemy work, and to consider that as allies and practitioners, when we walk along survivors, we can think about survivors in context, in their community of survivors, and what is the change that we can create for to the systems that created the ability to exploit human beings in the first place. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. This is when I learned that I should be an academic, because I like to lecture and talk. But I will look at the Q&A here and see. So I think Haley has asked, would you say that you're having more empowerment focus, and how is that model different from other models? Yeah. So I haven't looked at sort of academic definitions of empowerment, but it's in our mission. Survivor Alliance's mission is to unite and empower survivors of human trafficking. But I think what's clear is that we don't think that we have the power and we're giving other people power. We definitely think about the work as awakening people to their own power, and to really question the where people have been told that they don't have power, but also looking at structural and systemic power and injustice. So I do think that we have an empowerment focus, but this isn't the pretty version of resilience and empowerment where it's just kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps empowerment, but to think about the environment and systems that enable somebody to access their own power. Because I'm sure you know, what's the point of helping somebody heal from their trauma if they just walk out the door and can experience it again, right? So we're looking at a systemic approach to empowerment. So there's a question here that was anonymous. In settings where survivors are likely to interact with social workers or other human services professionals, are there particular changes in policies or procedures that could be implemented to help improve the experiences of survivors interacting with those systems? Yes, I mean, I will beat this drum until the cows come home. Sorry for mixing metaphors. That making sure that policies, programs, and practices are survivor informed. So I think in any human services agency, there can be a review of policies and practices from the perspective of somebody who's a service user or a survivor. So that can be everything from intake forms to the physical environment, to how MDTs are run, to making sure there's a survivor on your interview panels for professionals, to making sure that if you do 360 reviews of professionals, that there's a way to get feedback from service users or clients, as I think the US uses more. So I certainly, so in the US, there's the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Agency, I believe. They have a pretty decent, thick manual on trauma-informed approaches. And remember that trauma-informed approaches comes from the ACEs study. So recognition that most people, by the time they're an adult, have had some adverse childhood experience. And so dividing, rather than, let's think about the 1 or 2 people who are going to come in with trauma, actually approaching it from most people have had some trauma is really key. How do you get involved upon graduation? Sign up for a newsletter. You'll see opportunities for volunteering and others. You're a newbie to this field and trying to learn all you can. What are your favorite ways, trainings, or tools for therapists to manage the secondary trauma of working with this population? Are there any best models to use for working? Okay, so for the first part about managing secondary trauma, here I go to the structural. So let's not ask people to prevent vicarious trauma and then still give people caseloads of 60 plus individuals. So it needs to be structural, including structural ways of facilitating individual practices to manage vicarious trauma. So I think, so Survivor Alliance makes sure that we have a trauma-informed supervisor. We don't do clinical work, but essentially it's like clinical supervision for your staff. I think that having really structured practices for managing one's own trauma so that it doesn't get projected onto clients is really important. I think being able to practice and learn intent versus impact, because one of the things I see a lot of is this need to be seen as I have good intentions. But remember that you may be the person that someone is relearning that humans can be decent human beings. So you are the person that someone is trialing this idea, or maybe you could reaffirm that no, all humans are just horrible. So you need to be able to manage your own stuff about that, your own need to be seen as a good human being, your own savior mentality. So having spaces to talk about them. Best models to use for working. I mean, I certainly would say Survivor Alliance has a pretty decent model, but always incorporating lived experience voice and paying people, but not tokenizing people. So genuinely seeing people beyond their trauma and to think about how to develop people into our own roles. We certainly have a lot to give and have a lot to share, but I think that creating a pathway for employment for survivors into our own work is really important. Peer support models are really key. Mutual aid was huge, just because there are not opportunities for community building in many ways. It's really, we have affinity groups for language and hobbies and etc. But in terms of survivors of violence, it's often a hard space for people to find. Can you please speak to the Indigenous methodologies that were considered or used? So I think what's important about Indigenous methodologies is that they aren't necessarily methodologies in the way that we think of them, but naming something rather than, I would say my whole project was the Indigenous methodology in the sense that I was seeking to define well-being, not from the academic perspective. I mean, sure, I put it in language that academics can understand, but I was taking it from, not taking it in terms of reappropriating, hopefully, but having it sourced from people's lived experience. And so that for me, it was an attempt to name something of our own. And I think one of the things that's challenging is often when you think of Indigenous methodologies, it could be a literal other language that people use, you know, saying there's not a word for this phenomenon in English, but because I'm still speaking in English, it can be misinterpreted. And I wish I had a different language to give to say, no, that's not what I meant. There's a, I would even say a different epistemology, a different language that survivors can speak from. All of my questions just disappeared. Oh, they're answered. Oh, because that's okay. It's a repeat question. I've heard messages about see something, say something. Since we're not likely to see someone in chains, what should we look for? And second, in terms of being supportive, if we learn someone is a survivor and recognizing people may be at an early point of sharing suggestions for respectful language. I'm going to say something controversial, which is I don't like doing a spot the signs training because there's a lot of bias in that. I'm not saying if you really see something that your own, like, trust your intuition and you think something's wrong, whether it's human trafficking or domestic abuse or whatever, you say something, right? But the reason why I think it's, again, a very individualistic model. Like, I can save this person by reporting it. I personally would recommend that we invest our energy in systems change. Why are people vulnerable? Poverty, histories of abuse, addiction, climate vulnerabilities, so people are migrating, other forms of oppression that put people at risk. So if we focus on that, then there are people who are trained to do things in airports and etc. So for me, it's counterproductive sometimes to be, I'm the individual and I'm going to focus on saving this person here. But sure, the signs, you can Google what signs should I look for, and I think that's probably what most people will say. In terms of not adding to the trauma, one, I think we have to try and not be so walking on eggshells. You may, and that's okay. But I think what's important is anything that someone shared that's quite personal, it's always really useful to say, wow, thank you for sharing something so personal. Or I understand that you may or may not want to talk about that, but I'm somebody who's happy to listen. I don't want to assume, but if that's something you would like support with, I'm happy to help find resources for you. So I think, should I just reading this other question? Yeah, I think kind of just being a kind, friendly face that is open to this person talking to again. I think what's important is to not, go, oh my gosh, are you okay? Or pity them or kind of now treat them outside of the context of if you know them from church, treat them like you would any other church person. If you know them from soccer, treat them like other soccer teammates, right? So trying not to see them as different. Acknowledging you can't come culturally competent in human trafficking by listening to one 90-minute presentation, could you please give us a few more specific things we need to know to help move us a bit toward that competency? So I think I was not brought in to train you on sort of the basics of what human trafficking is. I think there's plenty out there on it. In terms of being culturally competent about human trafficking, I think it's important, especially as US citizens, to know that it's both something that happens to people who live in the United States as well as abroad. People are trafficked within the US borders. People are trafficked into the US. You may hear divides around sex trafficking versus labor trafficking, but those divides are can be really not as clear cut as it's talked about. People are exploited in all types of industries. Happens to children, it happens to adults, it happens to people of all ethnicities and races. So I think that what's key is that someone is forced into a situation without their choice and forced to perform services or labor for somebody else, and they are not paid, and they're abused, threatened if they leave. I think kind of in agriculture, the commercial sex industry, domestic work. Some people have been exploited into nursing, into that it can connect with other vulnerabilities. So there's another question. Thanks for this question. So how do survivors work through the strain of feeling the pressure to educate people about trafficking or slavery? I think what's important is that if there is a survivor in this sector who's doing the work, we've had to come to some peace with that and decide we're doing some level of education. I think what's challenging is if a survivor has not gotten to choose that. And so I think what's important as practitioners is, yes, while we may want to empower people to become lived experience experts, we want to make sure that they have what they need to make that decision, because there are some negative consequences of going public. We do have a resource that we helped to build, and I'll find the link and put it in the chat for if you come across a survivor who's thinking about joining the sector and sharing either their experience or educating people to think about in what way and what some of the things that many other survivors have thought through. So let me find that link. We got time for another couple of questions. Oh, I think I might have to send this to someone to send it out to everybody, or I'm not sure. But maybe if I answer a Q&A live. Yeah, okay, there it is. Thank you, Danielle. So if you scroll down that link, there's a toolkit, and we created it with a handful of other survivors in the US, and it's a way that you can hear from other survivors about their, what they wish they had knew before becoming an advocate. Anything else?
Does anybody have any other questions they want to submit through the Q&A?
You mentioned that trafficking is now sensationalized. Does that help the general efforts to find survivors? I have no idea. I think data is very hard to find. In terms of my personal opinion, I think it can make it harder to find survivors, because if they don't fit that image, people won't see themselves as a survivor. I think most people learn about kind of the concept or term of human trafficking and identify with it after the fact. Yeah, I think really it's maybe raised awareness of the issue, but it's also led to misunderstandings about the issue.
Hello, I am Dr. Lindsay Jasinski, so I'm the MSW Program Director and Associate Professor at the College of Social Work. Dean Osteen had to leave our webinar a few minutes early to lead a campus meeting, so I'll be wrapping our session up today. I just want to say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I really appreciated how you address these structural inequities rather than just trying to find individual solutions, as well as the importance of addressing both individual and collective well-being. It was such a wonderful presentation, but I would like to thank everyone who helped to make this event happen. So again, to our highly respected presenter, Dr. Minh Dang, thank you for joining us from the UK, especially given our time zone differences. Thank you for your scholarship on this critical issue, and thank you all for joining us live today, as well as those who might watch this recording of this presentation later. Just as the MSW Program Director, I'd like to promote the fact that we do offer an online elective on human trafficking. So if you're an MSW student, please go ahead and look for that. The College of Social Work is dedicated to this speaker series as part of our effort to address the grand challenges of social work. So we anticipate one more Grand Challenges presentation this academic year, and hope you'll join us again as we delve into more research presentations addressing the major challenges our society is facing. You can find details about all our events on the college's events webpage. So thank you again for being a part of this event. Take care. And again, thank you to Dr. Dang. Have a nice day.
Thank you all. Bye.